Hello everyone, Jay Warden here, and welcome to my recap and review of the episode Symbiosis, a simplistic, mediocre episode that keeps telling us that drugs are bad. And really, drugs are bad, okay? Don't forget those spoilers, otherwise enjoy. The Enterprise is observing a star going through some unusually intense solar activity, which, while fascinating for the crew, is starting to cause some heavy interference in their systems. Their observations though are interrupted by a distress call from an Onaran ship in orbit on one of the nearby planets, but due to the interference can't establish a clear signal, so Picard moves the ship in to assist. Once they arrive, they find a very old freighter in a decaying orbit and is minutes away from burning up in the atmosphere. The Onaran captain introduces himself as T'Jon and in an extremely vague fashion says there's something isn't working on his ship but doesn't seem to know what. Eventually Data figures out the problem with the freighter and Picard offers a replacement part to T'Jon, but they don't have the tools or apparent knowledge of what to do, and everyone is starting to get a little bit frustrated at the apparent total ineptitude of this freighter crew. Sadly though, they've run out of time as the freighter starts burning up in the atmosphere, so Picard sends Yar down to get the crew beamed aboard. With increased disruption from the solar activity, Yar has some trouble but eventually establishes a lock and tries to beam the crew over, instead receiving their cargo. Everyone seems incredulous that even as they're about to die, they send their cargo over instead, so Yar tries again and manages to rescue 4 of the 6 crew members on board as the freighter explodes. Captain T'Jon, also known as Captain Kirk's son David, immediately demands to see the cargo to make sure it's okay, apparently completely unconcerned at the loss of 2 members of their crew, so Riker takes him to the cargo bay. However, once there, an argument ensues between T'Jon and a chap called Sobi, also known as Khan's right-hand man Yuakin, making me wonder who else from the Wrath of Khan might show up in this episode. Sobi and his companion Langor argue that they never received their payment from the Ornarans since the freighter has since blown up, so tells T'Jon the Ornarans can't have their cargo, something called Felicium, and a fight breaks out between them, showing off some sort of innate ability to use electrical-based attacks on each other. Yar manages to break up the fight and gets her security minions to escort them to the conference room. Once there, after promising to give the Ornarans some spare parts to fix their remaining freighters, the two sides continue to squabble over the ownership of the cargo, so Picard demands some answers as to what's so important about this stuff. It seems the Felicium is some sort of medicine the Ornarans desperately need to combat a plague that only the Brekkians, a race from a neighbouring planet, can produce. Sobi and Langor, coming off like uncaring elitist twats, refuse to give them the current shipment of Felicium since their payment went down with the freighter, and thus we arrive at the current stalemate. However, Picard is more immediately concerned about this apparent plague the Ornarans carry, and wanting to make sure it isn't contagious to his crew, calls Dr. Beverly to give them a good checkup. In sickbay, T'Jon and his companion Romas seem to be deteriorating rapidly in health, becoming very jittery and shaky. Picard then arrives, and in private Dr. Beverly explains that although the Ornarans show all signs of a disease, she can't find any cause for it, but doesn't think they're going to die at least. Picard then tries to have another chat with T'Jon, but they simply keep demanding access to the Felicium quickly before all the Ornarans die, so Picard says he'll go and have a chat with the Brekkians to see what he can do. In their quarters, the Brekkians continue to look and behave like uncaring elitist twats, but Picard asks them to at least allow T'Jon and his mate to have their dose to improve their condition, and Langor agrees on the condition that they come along to distribute it themselves. In the cargo bay, they explain the process to Picard and Dr. Beverly and how the Ornarans only need a very tiny dose to keep them healthy, for a few days at least, after which they'll need another dose as this plague apparently cannot be directly cured. Dr. Beverly seems to be developing some suspicions though about this strange disease that seems so virulent yet can't find a specific cause for. The Brekkians then further explain that their entire planet's industry is dedicated to the production and refinement of the Felicium, and in exchange the Ornarans provide the Brekkians everything they need. And suddenly the reason for their twattery becomes all too clear. Dr. Beverly takes the provided dose to sickbay, and after administering it, the Ornarans immediately seem much better, but they're also getting quite a buzz out of it, confirming Dr. Beverly's suspicions that something really isn't right here, so she goes to Picard and tells him she thinks the Felicium is not a medicine but actually a very addictive narcotic, pretty much making every Ornaran a drug addict rather than a victim of a plague. On the bridge, Riker and Data had done some research into the histories of the two planets and found that long ago the Ornarans were a technologically advanced society whilst the Brekkians remained rather primitive. However, 200 years ago, the Ornarans were indeed struck by a plague that could only be cured by a specific plant on the Brekkians' homeworld, as it wouldn't grow on their own. As a result, a trade agreement was established where the Ornarans would give the Brekkians all their cool stuff in exchange for the Felicium. It did indeed cure the plague, but because of its highly addictive properties as well, the Brekkians decided it would be much better not to tell the Ornarans that they were cured, and instead simply exploited the situation to their advantage, and here we come to our moral prime directive dilemma of the week. Picard cannot intervene despite such a nasty situation, which Dr. Beverly finds abhorrent, and the two have an argument about it before receiving a transmission from Ornara. In their guest quarters, Picard and Riker let T'Jon speak with the surface where things are apparently very dire, so T'Jon once again pleads with Picard to give them the Felicium, but he continues to refuse. In response, T'Jon starts electrocuting Riker, who pulls the most hilarious expressions and says if they won't give it to them right now, he'll kill Riker. Picard still refuses to back down though, believing TNG is no killer, and he's proven right when he reluctantly releases Riker. Langor then arrives and says she wants to have a private chat with Picard, so he and Dr. Beverly go to their quarters where Sobi and Langor say they're now prepared to happily give the Ornarans the Felicium and that they can pay them back whenever they're able. Picard, however, understands the game now and explains to them he knows what they're up to. They look sheepishly at him and ask if he's going to tell the Ornarans about this, but Picard says he can't because of the Prime Directive, and that he'll still let the Ornarans have the Felicium despite Dr. Beverly's angry protests, causing Langor to pull off her best smug as fuck look. In the cargo bay, Picard informs the Ornarans of the Breccians' decision, but revokes his earlier promise of giving the Ornarans the spare parts they needed to fix their freighters, alarming both sides, particularly the Breccians. Picard simply explains the Prime Directive won't let him, and being a sassy fucker, points out the Breccians had no problem with his non-interference when it suited them, before letting them all beam down to the planet. Picard and Dr. Beverly then have a little moral talk about the Prime Directive before telling the Forward to just get us the fuck out of this silly little system. So after a trio of relatively fun and interesting episodes, we're back to typical Season 1 quality with an at best middling episode that has a very on the nose allegory that drugs are bad, guy. It's a pretty simple and relatively interesting concept at least, one society completely addicted to a drug that only another society can produce, and in exchange for materials and goods directly benefiting off the other's addiction and misery. However, I think the biggest problem here is it just remains that, simple. With both societies portrayed in simplistic terms, and even if you try to look too deeply into how either society would function on a day-to-day basis given their arrangement, it would quickly fall apart. So take the Ornarans for example. Are we to believe that for 200 years not one of their people has ever not taken that drug for a while, gone through withdrawal, and then realised that they didn't actually die? Do they feed their children at birth this drug? I guess you could argue that after having it for so long, their bodies could actually become totally dependent on it, but that's never once implied here, with Crusher saying very clearly that at worst they'll suffer some nasty withdrawal and then be totally okay. But putting that aside, how does their society function on a day-to-day basis otherwise, when they're all going around as high as a kite? The episode explains that once upon a time they were very technologically advanced, but like the Aldeans in When the Bow Breaks, they seem to have lost any understanding of how their technology even works anymore. So just how do they keep the day-to-day running of their civilization going? And then there's the Breccians, who have devoted their entire industry to making and refining this drug for the Ornarans so that they receive all of the luxuries and technologies the Ornarans have to offer. But how exactly are the Ornarans still doing this after 2 centuries of being high? As said, they've clearly lost their understanding of their own technology. I mean, I highly doubt they've got any real efficient means of manufacturing new or quality items, and we get a good idea that the Breccians live in luxury by comparison. So I honestly don't know how the Breccian society itself functions either, by relying entirely on the Ornarans to provide their day-to-day needs. They must realise that eventually the Ornarans will at some point completely lose their ability to send stuff to them. After all, the episode makes a big point about the Ornarans' freighters being very old and on the verge of breaking down completely, and at the end the Breccians get very upset with Picard when he refuses to help repair them. I mean, did the Breccians not once consider that perhaps constructing their own freighters, or at least understanding how the tech works themselves, might benefit them in the long run in keeping their tiny little arrangement going? So hopefully you see what I mean. If you look too closely into this, the whole situation just kind of falls apart. Also of no relevance at all is both races have an inbuilt ability to make these kind of electrical attacks, which is utterly pointless, though it does give us some absolutely gold facial expressions from Riker when he's being held by TNG. As for how the characters portray themselves, I found myself just not really caring that much, with both sides just going round and round in circles most of the time arguing about who owns the Felicium and getting payment for it. The only reason the Breccians cave in finally is because they know what the game is and know it's in their best interest to allow the Ornarans to keep believing the lie rather than let them go through withdrawal and realise they won't actually die. Otherwise, both sides just come off as very two-dimensional, with TNG and Romos being mostly twitchy and agitated, while Sobi and Langor spend most of the time being contemptible elitists. I will give credit to both Merritt Buttrick and Richard Lineback, who both do decent jobs portraying their agitation and desperation for the drug, and Kimberly Farr as Langor did a superb job of coming off so contemptible in her attitudes. I mean, just look at the sneer on her face. Judson Scott though was by far the weakest actor here, and he's popped up in track a couple of times over the years, but each time I'm just left with the feeling of a rather uninspired and flat performance. The other big play here is this is another moral Prime Directive episode, and though I think this is handled better than previous Prime Directive dilemmas we've had so far, it's still not great. I will say that the opening 10 minutes were relatively interesting and fun as the crew initially do some science stuff with the star they're observing, and then their frustrations in rescuing the hilariously incompetent Ornarans from their stricken freighter. But once we come to understand the situation, Picard has the unenviable position here of having to defend the pragmatic decision of non-interference, and I do happen to largely agree with it. It's up to both societies to eventually figure out their own problems and try and come up with some eventual solution. If Picard does help the Ornarans out and let them know what's going on, it would probably throw Brekkian society into absolute chaos, and may even lead to a war between both races, as I'm sure the Ornarans would be quite angry at having been kept in such a subservient position all these years. As much as the episode wants us to hate the drug-pushing Brekkians, how will things be any better if we cause both societies to collapse by trying to help? Crusher on the other hand makes the big moral argument that it's unconscionable to allow so many people to suffer when we have the means to help them. Unfortunately, this point is made with loud arguments from Crusher, and once again Gates McFadden proves to me she's just not very good when it comes to this kind of forceful acting. I do agree with her position from a moral standpoint, but you're just as likely to open up a whole new can of worms with unforeseen consequences by interfering as I've just explained, so to me it's a hard choice of doing the right or moral thing, or doing the correct pragmatic thing. The end is an interesting, if slightly controversial, conclusion when Picard, having initially promised to help fix the Ornaran freighters, withdraws that help, meaning that eventually the arrangement between the two planets will disintegrate and chaos will eventually ensue. This would have happened anyway if the Enterprise had never shown up here, but given the situation it seems the next best thing Picard can do in the long run to help the Ornarans break away from this horrific cycle of dependence without directly interfering, and it would force the Brekkians into coming to terms with this because otherwise he is knowingly helping them continue their agenda. So aside from an interesting moral debate to be had here, the episode portrays it in a largely dull, simplistic and uninteresting way, and just in case you didn't get the message that drugs are bad, guy, there's this cringy in-your-face scene between Yar and Wesley where Yar explains to him why people want drugs and the destruction they can bring, whereas Wesley is totally naive and just doesn't understand. This is not a terrible episode, but it's hardly a great one either, and quite forgettable as well. Except maybe for those Riker expressions. I'm gonna have to probably use those in my future videos, they're just so good. Next time the crew encounter an evil oil slick and we say goodbye to a much unloved member of the crew in the episode Skin of Evil. Please feel free to leave any comments or feedback, and if you liked this episode then please do like, subscribe and share. This has been Jay Warden, signing off.